Right, this isn't going to be my most high-tech recording that I've ever done, and I'm going to have to speak fairly low because there's people in bed. But I'll talk you through these 4 questions. So I've chosen 8. These are the 4 that I'm going to go through in our lesson tomorrow. And you can see I've already started to plan one of them. But I've started and given some thought to what I'd do in all of these questions, or at least what the possibilities would be. So starting with the one here about the foreign policy of the United States in those 30 years being dominated by isolationism. Well, we'll skip down to my answer. Samoa, Philippines, Hawaii, Spanish-American War and the First World War, the notion that foreign policy was dominated by isolationism is ridiculous. There's just too many examples of America getting engaged with things abroad where they didn't strictly have to. However, if you flip it a little bit, you could argue that aside from a diversion in you could even say 1916 really, when they really started to get more heavily involved in the Allied side, US foreign policy was dominated by the Monroe Doctrine. Much of their intervention was in their sphere of influence in the world. So what you could argue, if you're being very clever in this first question, is it really depends on your definition of isolationism. If Latin America doesn't count as isolationism because of the Monroe Doctrine, then America was dominated by isolationism. However, if you discount the Monroe Doctrine and say, any involvement abroad counts as going against isolationism, then certainly not. So you could really fall down, but just the fact that you mention and separate the Monroe Doctrine and isolationism would help you to stand out. My argument would be it was dominated by the Monroe Doctrine rather than isolationism, aside from some incursions into the Far East, which I write about here, and also the First World War and thereafter. And as you can see there, another clever point would be isolationism was not the policy of Wilson after the First World War between 1918 and when he died, but it was the preferred policy of the electorate. So there we go, some angles that you can take up with foreign policy in that period. On to the second question. The main reason for the growth of the progressive movement was the need to regulate big business. Well, I've decided that the main reason for a dramatic change in the outlook by the political elite in the Republican Party was that they recognised that America had changed and therefore they had to change to keep ahead. Had they not reacted, the Democrats may have stolen a march on them, and the 8 years of Cleveland as the Democrat president, especially in relation to this question, which is about 1890, especially that second term of 1893 to 97, gave the Republicans the impetus, which means gave them a push, they really had to, for a dramatic change in approach. Once it had proved popular with Roosevelt, it was only going to become further entrenched. But what you could say, a clever thing to say is, you could argue that the progressive movement didn't really get going until Roosevelt took the presidency. That's another possible angle. It depends. With all of this, remember, nobody really cares what you think, what your true opinion is. If you're stuck between certain decisions, just think, what could I find it easier to argue, and go with that one. So, the rapid growth of the US economy. How often does the economy appear in questions? So often. Do make sure you've spent a lot of time revising economy particularly. It's going to be on there in your exam somewhere, whether it's in the essays or whether it's in the interpretations. Anyway, it says because it was the expansion of the railroads. Well, I think we've looked at this question a little bit before. In my opinion, the railroads were more of a symptom of the expansion of the US economy rather than a cause, but when they were built, of course, they did have a significant impact on the economy. A bigger reason, though, was government policy. It was government action that allowed the railroads to be built at all because they'd offered land at either side of the tracks to the railroad companies, and it was government policy that encouraged migration west, which was important. It was government policy which brought gold to the economy because they made treaties with Native Americans and broke them when it seemed convenient because gold was found on the land. The government encouraged the opening of the West through the Homestead Act. So my opinion would be it was the actions of the government which created the conditions which would allow rapid growth of the US economy. And the railroads were one example of this. There's lots of different paragraph opportunities. I've not really talked about the paragraphs, but you can see them hopefully in the video. For this, you've got to do one on the expansion of the railroads. Of course you do. Actually, I'll probably scrap that one because I've decided I would take it as government policy altogether. You could then write a paragraph possibly about the impact of immigration on the economy, forcing down wages, and there's constantly a supply of cheap labour available. And also, the immigration may have led to the overcrowding, which gave people the, that word again, that impetus to want to move west. And the movement west and the development of the west was really important for the US economy, as you can see here. So there we go. If you go back, hopefully you can see the other paragraphs over there, but I'll move on, so I don't want to drone on forever. Hopefully you get the gist of it from the video here. Reconstruction was a failure. Assess the validity of this view. Well, I thought about this. I had a really good think about this, and there's two ways you could have approached a question like this. You could have said, well, Reconstruction was a failure to who? You could look at the black population, the White House politicians, or the Southern whites. Or you could look at the aims of Reconstruction. And really I could only put that into two categories, but that might be a clever way to go. If you're looking at a question, you're thinking, I don't know whether I should be doing, I can't think of a third paragraph. Just write two clever paragraphs. Don't try and shoehorn a third paragraph where it doesn't fit. And in this case, I think, well, I'm sure I could get an A star because this would be a clever argument. And there seem to be two key aims to Reconstruction. One, they wanted to knit the country back together after the Civil War. And two, they wanted to replace the social and economic structures of the pre-war South, which was based on slavery, with new social structures. Anyway, the first thing that you need to do for a question about Reconstruction was a failure is define what the aims of Reconstruction were. So I've made that note there. Even if you went through this bit in the introduction, you'd have to define, before you can judge something as a failure, what was it trying to achieve. My conclusion would be, whether it was a failure really depends on perspective. To a Southern black, it was a catastrophic failure. I'm sure I don't need to elaborate on that. For a while they stood in the sun, all that jazz. To a Southerner, full stop, it was probably seen as a failure. If you were a Southern white, you were resentful of it. You just wanted rid of it. It led to the carpetbaggers and all that sort of thing. But to a Northern White House politician, they probably felt quite pleased ultimately with what happened. That it did knit the country back together. There was no more civil war. There were deep scars of resentment. But replacing the social structure, it did to an extent. But the Southern blacks, the ex-slaves, well, they were to suffer for most of the next 100 years. So yeah, the clever argument here is it depends on perspective. It was a failure from whose opinion. And there we go. I hope to see some of you there in our last session tomorrow, where I'll go through the following questions. So presidents of the Gilded Age were weak, mass immigration that brought the expansion to the economy slightly later years than this question. And we've got America married a divided society to 1920, tricky question. And to what extent the US policy of containment be described as a success? So that's tomorrow. Hope you find these useful. And there we go.